I remember that evening with the kind of clarity age gives to moments one never valued at the time. Beaumont Street lay before me in its usual reluctant glow, the lamps breathing their pale half-light over the museum walls as though even they were hesitant to illuminate what waited there. I'd left the pub earlier than habit dictated, a quiet discontent stirring in me after failing to untangle a crossword whose setter clearly enjoyed humiliating the weary. A clue involving an obscure Venetian painter lingered in my thoughts, mocking me with its neatness, its smug inevitability. I walked with a looseness that felt almost disassociated, the drizzle hovering in the air like a promise Oxford rarely intends to keep. It was the silence that first alerted me. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of subdued murmuring that floats around an unexpected gathering, the sort that pulls one's gaze even when one would rather continue home to an overdue supper. A small knot of figures stood upon the Ashmolean steps, their faces lit by the subtle horror reserved for situations that appear mundane but feel unmistakably wrong. I saw Lewis before I saw the fallen man. He was speaking in that low register he uses when he wants to sound calm but knows he isn't. When I joined him, he shifted slightly, as though adjusting the weight of the evening. He said it was a tutor from St. Athanasius College who collapsed without warning. No marks, no violence, nothing but the soft, almost apologetic slump of a man who had reached the end of something he hadn't been prepared to name. The watch, he added, was found beside him. An old thing, its case tarnished, the glass faintly chipped, as though it had carried 1,000 small accidents without complaint. It had stopped at precisely 5:47 p.m. I crouched near the body, keeping what little dignity the situation allowed. He was maybe in his late 40s, though difficult to say Oxford has a way of aging or preserving its inhabitants according to whims of its own. His expression didn't suggest agony. Rather, it resembled the moment one realizes a long unsolved question has finally answered itself, and one isn't sure whether to be disappointed or relieved. The watch bothered me. Something in the angle of its fall. I sensed a misalignment, an arrangement too neat for the disorder of sudden collapse. I have always distrusted objects that lie too precisely where they shouldn't. Lewis asked if I felt something strange about the scene. I answered only that he should look at the bystanders. One or two had that unsettling composure of people who know more than they wish to share. A curator from inside the museum hovered near the door, her arms folded tightly, her eyes drifting not to the body, but to the top step, as though seeing a memory rather than a moment. I asked her quietly if she had noticed anything unusual. She hesitated long enough that her silence gave more than her words eventually would. She mentioned an argument. Nothing dramatic, only a muted exchange between the tutor and a well-spoken young man earlier that afternoon. She had dismissed it as academic pettiness. The drizzle thickened slightly, but still refused to fall, as though the sky too was undecided. I studied the tutor's hands, the faint ink stains along the edges of his fingers, the unmistakable calligraphy of someone who annotated compulsively. I wondered what final notation he might have made had he lived another hour. Lewis, growing impatient, suggested it might have been a heart attack. Natural, regrettable, unremarkable. But I knew better than to trust the simplicity of a clean narrative. Oxford rarely deals in such charity. It was the stopped watch that returned my thoughts to the crossword clue, a painter known for freezing storms in their moment of impending release. Something about that symmetry unsettled me. As Lewis signaled for the ambulance crew, I felt the first faint drop of rain settle on my cheek. Not the rain itself, only the warning of what was coming. There was a quiet unease in the air the following morning, the kind that settles over a college before the dons have finished their first cups of tea. I walked through St. Athanasius with the sense of entering a building that preferred its mysteries unsolved, its truths wrapped in the comforting dust of academic tradition. The porter greeted me with a politeness that felt stretched thin by the events of the previous evening. He mentioned that Dr. Edwin Lane's keys had been collected from the police already and were waiting for me, as though they were relics of a saint whose sanctity had yet to be confirmed. Lane's rooms were on the second floor, overlooking a narrow quadrangle that seemed perpetually shaded. The stairway creaked under my steps in that familiar, reproachful way old wood speaks to those who disturb its rest. His door opened with a reluctance. I understood it well. I've always thought the doors of dead men should resist a little, as though still deciding whether those left behind have the right to enter. His study was tidier than I expected, though a few papers lay scattered with the weary chaos of someone who had stopped working only because their body no longer allowed them the luxury. I stood there, absorbing the faint smell of paper and something old drink, perhaps, or the ghost of tobacco. Lewis remarked that it looked ordinary enough. I told him it was the ordinary that troubled me, because men who die with secrets usually leave behind an imbalance, however slight. On Lane's desk lay a supervision list of 3 students, each name written in a neat hand that revealed more tension than composure. His handwriting pressed harder into the page toward the end, as though something had been weighing on him. I paused over the middle name, recognizing it faintly from a case years earlier. A trivial matter, then, but trivial matters have a habit of maturing into nuisances when revisited, under different lights. Lewis sifted through a few folders and commented that Lane seemed meticulous. I corrected him gently. Men do not leave half-written notes tucked beneath college bills. I found one such note, a remark about a meeting planned later in the week, but the time had been struck out twice. A man uncertain of his own appointments, or perhaps uncertain of the company he would keep. On a bookshelf near the window sat an assortment of volumes, monographs on medieval rhetoric, essays on translation theory, and a thin book of poetry whose spine had softened with use. I pulled it free with a kind of reverence. Horace, in a worn translation. Inside the first page was a small penciled annotation of the hour a man confronts truth. I felt Lewis glance my way, wondering if I had found something significant. I wasn't sure yet, though the watch at 5:47 began tapping at the back of my mind again, like an unwelcome visitor knocking at an unlit door. A curator from the Ashmolean joined us briefly, her voice strained with the fragile politeness of someone who fears their words will matter more than intended. She repeated the story from last night about an argument, soft but tense, between Lane and a young man. She insisted it was nothing alarming. I asked her about Lane's demeanor. She hesitated long enough for the answer to reveal itself before she spoke. Distracted, she said. Troubled, but trying not to be seen as such. Before leaving, I noticed a small indentation on the wooden floor by his desk, barely visible unless one stood at a precise angle. A chair dragged recently, but not by him. The legs were too heavy for the slight scrape to match Lane's own movements. Someone else had sat here. Someone confident enough to position themselves where Lane couldn't avoid their gaze. I left the room with a distinct feeling that the silence inside was deliberate, as though the secrets it held had chosen, for now, not to speak to me. I've often thought that students carry within them the peculiar mixture of bravado and fragility that Oxford cultivates so effortlessly. They speak with confidence, yet their eyes reveal the tremors of youth, ambition, and the dread of being found wanting. When Lewis and I crossed the quad to interview Lane's 3 supervisees, the air felt caught between morning brightness and late afternoon fatigue, a half-light that seemed appropriate for young people who lived in the penumbra of their own expectations. The first, a linguistic student named Harrington, sat in the common room with a book resting unopened on his lap. He looked at me with the tentative politeness of someone afraid I might read too much from the stillness of his hands. He spoke softly about Lane, describing him as brilliant but remote, fond of long pauses that left students unsure whether they had impressed him or merely exhausted his patience. Harrington said he had last seen Lane 2 days before the death, though his gaze drifted toward the window as he said it, as if seeking refuge in the leaves trembling outside. It was the way his foot tapped subtly against the floor that caught my attention, not in impatience, but in the rhythm of remembered guilt. I tucked that impression away, knowing better than to disturb it too soon. The second student, named Calder, greeted us with the easy charm of someone accustomed to admiration. He lounged in his chair with theatrical indifference, as if tragedy were merely another inconvenience in an otherwise promising academic life. He spoke of Lane with a casual warmth that felt curated, rehearsed almost. Yet when he misused a line of Tennyson while making some airy observation about scholarly expectations, I felt a flicker in the back of my mind. Lane had once corrected that very misquotation in a paper I'd glimpsed in his files. Either Calder had never absorbed the correction he must have received, or he had quoted it deliberately, a small act of defiance, perhaps, or something subtler. I did not press him. The young often reveal themselves more fully in their omissions than in their declarations. The third, Margaret Elwood, waited for us in the college library, a place whose dusty calm seemed to suit her far more than conversation. She was sharp in that quiet way I've always admired in certain women, intelligent without the need to prove it, self-contained to the point of disquiet. She described Lane as perceptive but exacting, a man who expected more from his students than he ever said aloud. When I asked about her last meeting with him, she paused long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably between us. She eventually claimed it had been brief and unremarkable, but her fingers, resting near the spine of a dictionary, tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of his name, as though recalling some unspoken disappointment or unfinished conversation. As we left the library, I noticed that the page she had been marking in her book concerned a discussion of ambiguous authorship in medieval texts, a subject Lane had published on. Her interest might have been academic, or it might have been a way of returning to something unresolved between them. I wondered whether the unresolved matter had been intellectual or personal. Both possibilities felt equally plausible in that fragile atmosphere. Walking back through the corridor, I told Lewis that each student had given us a portrait of Lane that was accurate, but incomplete. He asked what part I thought was missing. I said it was the truth that lies in the pauses, the hesitation, the tapping foot, the misquoted poet, the subtle tightening of a hand. Young people rarely conceal their feelings as well as they believe they do. Outside, the sky had dimmed just enough to remind me of the watch on the museum steps, a time frozen not by chance, but by intention. I felt certain Lane had left more marks on these students than any of them cared to admit, and that somewhere among them, a details mole, quiet, stubborn, was beginning to stir. I have always believed that rooms remember things their occupants would rather forget, and when I returned to Lane's quarters that grey afternoon, the stillness felt heavier than before, as though the air itself had absorbed whatever he had left unsaid. Lewis trailed behind me with the steady patience he reserves for moments he knows I would rather approach alone. The hallway creaked faintly, though no one else seemed nearby. Old colleges possess a talent for sounding inhabited even when empty, a kind of residual sighing from years of whispered confidences. The desk looked as if we had left it, yet something pulled me toward the small waste bin beside its trivial instinct, perhaps. But instinct has saved me from blundering into far worse errors than waste paper. I sifted through its modest contents, and at the bottom, folded and scorched along one edge, lay a fragment of a letter. Lewis commented that it looked as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to burn it. I didn't answer. The paper felt reluctant under my fingers, as though it resented rescue. I unfolded it carefully. Most of the ink had blurred into soft shadows, but a few phrases stood untouched. The matter from '98, a debt that cannot be repaid. Your silence will spare us all. I read the words twice, then a third time, waiting for them to offer more than they wished to. The handwriting was Lane's, though the tremor in the strokes suggested hesitation rather than age. I found myself imagining him seated here the previous evening, the lamplight flickering across his face, wrestling with the decision to destroy or preserve something too dangerous to exist in full daylight. Lewis asked what I thought it meant. I said only that the past has a way of writing its own footnotes and that Lane had been trying to erase one. He muttered something about old academic feuds. I let him believe that for the moment. People often underestimate the brutality of intellectual pride. I have seen envy and wounded scholarship produce more elegant forms of cruelty than any blunt instrument. Near the letter lay an old college photograph, tucked between two heavy volumes on rhetoric. 3 young tutors, arms folded with the stiff camaraderie common to men still half-formed in ambition. Lane was in the center. Behind them, blurred by age and the photographer's indifference, were the Ashmolean steps, the same stone, the same angle, almost the same light as the evening of Lane's death. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps he had been lured there because the past prefers familiar stages for its encores. I noticed a faint indentation on the corner of the photograph, as though someone had pressed their thumb against it with unnecessary force. A hesitation, a memory, a regret. People leave marks on the things they fear losing, or on the things they fear being found. A thin envelope rested beneath the photograph, sealed but unaddressed. Inside was a single page of translation notes, Latin scribbles, corrections, crossed-out lines. But among them, written in a hurried scrawl, was a short phrase, "The hour is wrong." I felt a small tightening in my chest. The watch again, always the watch. A natural death should not require timestamps to be rewritten. As I examined the envelope more closely, I noticed that the flap had been sealed twice. The faintest trace of old adhesive ran beneath the fresh line of gum, as though Lane had opened and resealed it, or someone else had. Whoever handled it had been careful, meticulous, deliberate enough to leave almost no sign. Almost. Before leaving, I set the burned letter fragment atop the translation notes. They did not belong together, yet they seemed to lean toward each other in uneasy companionship. Lewis asked if we were closer to understanding anything. I told him understanding wasn't what troubled me. Certainty was. Certainty never arrives kindly. It comes like a late visitor one hopes will not knock again. As we closed the door behind us, I glanced back once more. The room felt as though it wished desperately to remain silent, and I could not yet decide whether I wanted it to speak. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a college library in late afternoon, an almost monastic stillness that makes every footstep feel intrusive, every turning page an indiscretion. When Lewis and I returned to speak with Margaret Elwood, the shadows along the shelves had lengthened into something close to confession. She sat at one of the narrow wooden tables, the weak sunlight falling across her shoulders like a reprimand. I could see at once that she had been waiting for us, or perhaps waiting for the moment when waiting became unbearable. Lewis, with more gentleness than he is often credited for, asked if she had kept any notes from her supervisions with Dr. Lane. She hesitated, then pulled from her bag a small, leather-bound diary, one of those elegant notebooks students often buy with the intention of filling with brilliance, but end up using instead for the clutter of daily anxieties. She handed it to me with the reluctant air of someone surrendering the last piece of a private world. I opened it slowly, aware of the intimacy such an object demands. Her handwriting was sharp, almost architectural. The first few pages contained observations about lectures, fragments of Latin translations, and the occasional terse remark about Lane's exacting standards. Then the entries shifted slightly at first, then unmistakably. Details about late meetings, notes written in a tone too careful to be casual. A line about a conversation on truth and obligation. Another about feeling seen, though not necessarily understood. Near the end of one page, a phrase that made Lewis glance toward me with that familiar look of premature certainty. He said he would not let the past repeat itself. On the surface, it was damning. A clandestine bond, talks of past, mistakes, the sort of secrecy that might lead an overburdened student to rashness. Yet something in the phrasing troubled me. The language was too polished, the sentiment too neatly aligned with guilt. Young people rarely choreograph their inner turmoil so elegantly. Margaret watched me read, her eyes steady, but waited. I asked her, as gently as I could, whether she and Lane had been involved in anything beyond academics. Her answer came slowly, as though reluctant to be heard, even by herself. She said the diary exaggerated her feelings, that Lane had simply offered guidance during a difficult term. She insisted he had never crossed any boundary. Lewis muttered that the entries suggested otherwise, but I raised a hand to quiet him. What struck me more than her words was the deliberate stillness of her posture, as if she were bracing for a verdict she could not afford to contradict. I returned to one particular sentence. It read, "He told me that nothing would come of silence." The ink there was slightly darker than the surrounding lines, as though written with a firmer hand or on a different day. A detail, trivial perhaps, but diaries rarely reveal their truth through content. They reveal them through pressure, hesitation, the faint tremor of indecision caught in the stroke of a pen. This page felt written with intention rather than impulse. As we left the library, Lewis whispered that the girl was hiding something. I agreed, though not in the direction he imagined. The false trail lay not in her guilt, but in how perfectly arranged the evidence seemed. I found myself thinking of the crossword clue I'd abandoned earlier in the week, the one whose solution had felt too obvious, too symmetrical. A puzzle constructed to flatter the solver rather than challenge them. Margaret's diary offered us a narrative that aligned too conveniently with Lane's death. It provided motive, opportunity, and emotional tension wrapped in a tidy package. And like all tidy packages, it made me uneasy. Real life rarely affords such elegance. As we stepped outside, the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain that refused to fall. I felt the case shifting beneath my feet, like a walkway made of boards that creak only after you have committed your weight to them. Something in those pages had been written for us to find, and something quieter, more fragile, had been carefully left out. It was early evening when Lewis and I returned to the staircase, where the scholarship boy kept his rooms, those narrow, uneven steps that seemed designed to remind one of how many had climbed them burdened with hopes heavier than their books. The corridor smelt faintly of damp wool and the ghost of long-forgotten essays, that curious blend of ambition and fatigue particular to student lodgings. Calder greeted us with that careful nonchalance I had noticed before, leaning against his doorway as though the building itself required his casual charm to stand upright. He asked whether this concerned Dr. Lane's death, though his tone carried none of the innocence such a question pretends to. I told him it did. He invited us in with the ease of someone who believes hospitality is a form of defense. His room was immaculate in a way that suggested performative tidiness, books arranged not by subject but by aesthetic, papers stacked too evenly, a bottle of wine left conspicuously half-finished on the desk, as if to imply he had simply enjoyed a quiet night of refinement. Everything was arranged to be noticed. Everything is carefully staged. Lewis began with the usual inquiries, but Calder drifted through the conversation like a man aware of his audience. He spoke of Lane with affectionate exasperation, saying he had been a challenging tutor, brilliant but occasionally impossible. He admitted to borrowing money once or twice, small amounts, nothing of consequence. Yet there was an undertone, a faint, brittle quality to his assurances that made each one too polished to be trustworthy. Young men rarely confess to their flaws with such rhetorical grace unless they have rehearsed the lines beforehand. While he spoke, I noticed a slip of paper beneath a stack of newspapers on his desk. When he stepped away to fetch something, I lifted the corner just enough to see numbers scrawled in quick, anxious figures that suggested debt, not modest, but mounting, the sort that grows fangs when ignored. Calder returned before I could read more, though his eyes flickered momentarily toward the desk, a gesture so small it might have meant nothing. But I have learned that truth often reveals itself in glances rather than speeches. He claimed he had been in the JCR at the time Lane collapsed, surrounded by witnesses. Lewis asked for names, and Calder rattled off a list with impressive speed, though one of them, a young man I vaguely recalled, had been out of college that evening. I asked him about the argument the curator overheard near the Ashmolean. Calder hesitated, only for a heartbeat, before saying it must have been someone else. His voice had softened, and I could hear the faint strain beneath the composure. A young man lying is a fragile thing. The lie cracks long before the face does. Lewis muttered after we left that it looked straightforward, a student drowning in debt, ashamed of asking Lane for more help, perhaps fearing exposure. It was a neat explanation, and I could see why it appealed to him. But neatness is often the enemy of truth. As we walked through the courtyard, I remembered the misquoted Tennyson line Calder had tossed out with such practiced ease. It was Lane's correction, I recalled, not the misquotation itself, but the way Lane had once circled it in a student's essay with an almost impatient stroke. If Calder had written the line before, he would have known the correction. If he had only heard it from Lane, he would not have used it so carelessly. The thought settled in me with the weight of a faint but undeniable contradiction. A small detail, almost laughably slight, yet it hinted at something deliberate. Calder had wanted us to see his debts. He had wanted us to believe he had something to hide. False solutions often arrive wearing the most convincing masks. And as we stepped into the cool night air, I found myself sensing the subtle shift between performance and truth, the uneasy feeling that Calder had given us exactly what he intended to give, and nothing more. It was a muted, iron-colored morning when I sought out Harrington again, the linguistic student whose quiet unease had lingered with me long after our first conversation. The college corridors felt colder that day, their stones holding the chill with a stubbornness I envied. I found him in a small seminar room whose tall windows absorbed more light than they offered, leaving the space dim despite the hour. He was seated at a long oak table, a dictionary open before him, though the stillness of the pages suggested he had not turned one in some time. He looked up with that same fragile politeness, the sort that can disappear entirely if one pushes too hard. I told him I wished to clarify a few details, and he nodded, adjusting his glasses with a movement so habitual it seemed almost protective. He said he had not seen Dr. Lane on the day of his death, and had only heard the news from a friend later that evening. The words were clean, but the pause preceding them was too long, as though his silence had wanted to speak first. Lewis asked about his coursework, and Harrington shifted slightly in his chair. He confessed to having fallen behind, the pressures of translation and syntax weighing on him more than he liked to admit. I noticed a page on the table, an unfinished translation annotated with the kind of frantic pencil marks that reveal more about a student's state of mind than any spoken sentence. Among them, a phrase repeated twice, altus verbis, same meaning. A reminder, perhaps, or an admonition to himself. As he spoke, I found my attention drifting to the faint tapping of his foot beneath the table, the same nervous rhythm I had noticed before. It had returned, though his voice remained steady. I asked whether he had ever argued with Lane. He hesitated, then said not exactly. The not exactly struck me as significant. Students lie with absolutes. The uncertain phrasing belongs to someone trying to navigate the narrow gap between guilt and fear. He admitted, after some coaxing, that Lane had confronted him weeks earlier about a submission translation that bore uncanny resemblance to a published article. Harrington claimed it had been an accident, a convergence of phrasing rather than true plagiarism. I said nothing, though the explanation rang hollow. Linguists are acutely aware of the weight of words. Accidents in that realm are rarely accidents at all. Lewis pressed him on the matter, and Harrington's composure faltered. His hands, resting on the table, curled almost invisibly inward. He said he had avoided Lane afterward, embarrassed and frightened of what consequences might follow. He insisted he had not seen him again, but I noticed the faint scent of Lane's cologne lingering in the room, a subtle aromatic trace that felt out of place in a space dominated by old wood and dust. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or perhaps someone had been here recently who had not wanted to be remembered. As we prepared to leave, I paused near the window, looking out at the quadrangle where the first leaves had begun to fall. I asked Harrington whether he believed Lane had been disappointed in him. His eyes flickered with something like shame or fear, or both. He said he thought Lane expected too much from him, that he often felt like a linguistic puzzle the tutor was trying to solve. And in that moment, I sensed something raw beneath the surface. An admiration tangled with resentment, a young man overwhelmed by a mentor he could neither fully emulate nor fully escape. When we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis murmured that Harrington seemed harmless. I said harmless was not the word I would choose. People who speak little often feel too much their silence becomes a room they cannot always leave. And somewhere in Harrington's hesitant answers, a detailed faint contradiction, a shadow behind a sentence, had begun to stir again. Not loudly, not clearly, but with the quiet urgency of a truth that would not remain hidden forever. I've always believed that books, more than people, reveal their truths reluctantly. Some open themselves without resistance, eager to be known. Others conceal their meanings behind layers of ink and silence. When Lewis handed me the slim volume of Latin poetry, recovered from Lane's rooms, I felt at once that it belonged to the second category. Its spine was softened by use, yet the pages held the slight stiffness of a book that had been handled often but read selectively, as though its owner had sought something specific within it. The college office where we sat felt unusually still, the rain outside tapping faintly against the mullioned windows like a question it was too polite to insist upon. I opened the book to the page marked by a folded slip of paper. It was a verse I knew well. Horace, meditating on the inescapable hour that awaits every man. The kind of poem Lane would have annotated with academic detachment, yet here his handwriting, faint and hurried, trailed along the margins like the notes of a man trying to solve something not scholarly, but personal. Lewis asked whether the markings were significant. I did not answer immediately. Along the right margin, next to a line about truth arriving uninvited, Lane had written two numbers, 5 and 47, linked by a small horizontal stroke. Beneath them, barely visible, a second notation, tempus falsum. False time. I traced the faint graphite with my thumb, feeling the slight indentation the pencil had left behind. It was the kind of mark made by someone writing either in haste or with a mind already wandering elsewhere. Lewis reminded me, with that gentle impatience he reserves for my more contemplative moments, that the tutor's watch had stopped at precisely 547. I nodded, though the connection had already lodged itself firmly in my mind. If the hour in the poem was symbolic, then perhaps the hour on the watch had been intended to echo it. It would not be the first time a man tried to communicate from beyond his own silence with the only language he trusted. I turned the page, uncertain what I expected to find. The next leaf held no scribbles, but on the one after, near the foot of the page, Lane had drawn a small circle enclosing a single word, veritas. Truth. Yet what struck me more was the delicate crease in the paper, beginning near the spine and trailing outward as though the page had been gripped too tightly. Fear leaves traces, even on parchment. Lewis observed that the coded markings might indicate a meeting. I said that if Lane had intended a rendezvous, he would have been more explicit. Scholars do not communicate clandestinely by misquoting Horace. Or perhaps some do, I corrected myself silently. Oxford has a long history of dressing its secrets in academic garments. I closed the book and let it rest on the table between us. Something about the positioning of the markings and the alignment of the numbers with the verse unsettled me. If Lane had discovered a truth relating to the past, perhaps the matter from '98 he had been so reluctant to face, he might have encoded it in the language he knew best. But codes are rarely perfect. They reveal as much as they hide. Before leaving the office, I glanced once more at the open book. The slip of paper used as a bookmark had been torn from the corner of an envelope, the same creamy stock as the unaddressed envelope we found earlier. A small detail, but details have a habit of whispering to those who listen long enough. I folded the slip and placed it back where it belonged. As we stepped into the corridor, I felt the weight of the poem lingering with me. The hour a man confronts truth. And somewhere in the quiet margins of that verse, Lane had tried, perhaps too late, to confront his own. It is a peculiar cruelty of memory that the smallest details that one should have noticed, that one tells oneself, were hardly worth a second glance return with the sharpest clarity when it is already too late. I found myself thinking of this as I walked alone across the quad that evening, the lamplight wavering in the breeze like a tired scholar unsure of his own arguments. Lewis had gone back to the station to check a few records, but I remained at St. Athanasius, drawn by a faint disquiet that refused to name itself. The poem, the numbers, the stopped watch. They circled one another in my thoughts like hesitant dancers, always near enough to touch, never quite daring to. And somewhere among them lay the truth I had been circling since the night Lane died. But it was another memory that tugged at me, the curator's voice the evening of the collapse, her soft remark about a well-spoken young man arguing with Lane. At the time, I had assumed she meant a student. The entire investigation had been shaped around that assumption. But assumptions, I reminded myself bitterly, are the most elegant of traps. I returned to Lane's rooms with the kind of reluctance one feels before entering a church whose bells have not rung in years. The air inside was still, though not in the peaceful way of empty spaces. It had the weight of a room waiting to be understood. I switched on the desk lamp and stood for a moment, letting the dim light fall across the papers we had disturbed. The photograph of Lane with his two colleagues lay where I had left it, the faint indentation on its corner almost invisible now. And yet I saw it. For the first time, I truly saw it. One of the men in the photograph, a tutor whose name had barely flickered across my attention earlier in the case, stood not merely beside Lane but slightly in front, angled in a way that suggested intimacy rather than mere collegiality. A subtle leaning of the shoulder, a closeness that spoke of trust or history, the kind of pose people adopt unconsciously with those who have shaped their younger selves, and behind them the Ashmolean steps, as though the place itself had been part of their story long before it became part of their tragedy. I stared at the photograph until my eyes blurred. Then, with a slowness that bordered on dread, I reached for the translation notes from the envelope, the ones written in Lane's hurried scrawl. The phrase "the hour is wrong" struck me differently now. Not a note, not a reminder, a warning. In the margin code, "tempus falsum" sat beside it like a final plea for someone to see what he had been too afraid to say aloud. Lewis returned as I stood there, and he asked whether I had found something. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but the pieces were beginning to resist each other in a way that suggested they belonged differently than I had arranged them. He laughed lightly and said he never understood my metaphors. I said they weren't metaphors. They were the only way my mind could make sense of the things it refused to accept. He watched me pick up the book of poems and leaf once more through the marked pages. I asked him whether the curator had described the young man with any precision. Lewis said she had mentioned his posture, the confidence, the polish of someone accustomed to being listened to. I realized then that such qualities were far more common among dons than undergraduates. Students may be clever, but true posture, cultivated composure, is a faculty trait. A memory stirred the curator's glance toward the top of the steps, not toward the body. She had looked not where Lane had fallen, but where someone had stood. I returned the book to the desk and stepped back, letting the quiet of the room collect in the corners. The watch at 5:47 had never been about time of death. It had been placed, arranged as deliberately as the photograph had been once, as deliberately as someone had sealed and resealed the envelope. A message, a symbol, a moment chosen because it reflected something only two men could have known. And suddenly, painfully, I recognized the arrogance in my earlier theories, the neatness of suspecting the young, the convenient comfort of blaming students whose lives still trembled too visibly. I'd overlooked the stillness that hides deeper waters, the composed voices shaped by years of academic restraint. I stood there in Lane's silent room, the lamp throwing my shadow long across the floor, and felt the faint, merciless sting of understanding. The detail I should have seen had been waiting patiently, like a footnote someone hoped I would eventually read. And now that I had, the entire narrative shifted, quiet and irrevocable, toward a truth that no longer lay in youth, but in the polished, dangerous steadiness of the grown. There is a strange stillness to the Ashmolean after dusk, a kind of suspended breath that settles over the stone as if the building itself remembers too much. I stood at the foot of the steps that evening with the uneasy awareness that I had returned not for answers, but for confirmation of a truth I already feared was waiting for me. The lamplight caught in the rain-slicked pavement, reflecting the architecture in faint, trembling shapes. Lewis was beside me, though I sensed he understood that whatever remained of the case now belonged to the quieter corridors of my mind. We waited only a few minutes before he arrived, the colleague from the photograph, the well-spoken man whose presence had hovered at the edges of the investigation without ever fully stepping into the frame. His coat was immaculate, his expression composed in that way only years of academic discipline can teach. He approached with the hesitant dignity of someone who knows he is being summoned not as a witness, but as a participant in something final. He asked why I had asked him to meet here, in the exact place where Lane had fallen. I told him that some conversations require the geography of their beginnings. His eyes flickered, the faintest tremor of recognition passing through them. He said he had already spoken with us, that he had nothing more to add. I replied that memories have a way of correcting themselves when given the proper setting. For a moment, only the quiet splash of passing cars intruded on the silence. Then he asked whether this was about the past, about the matter from '98. There was no accusation in his voice, only a deep, tired resignation. I told him that I believed Lane had planned to reveal something connected to that old scandal, something he had carried alone for too many years. The tutor nodded slowly, his gaze drifting upward to the museum facade as if seeking refuge in its impassive stone. He spoke then, not with defensiveness, but with the sorrow of someone who has rehearsed their guilt for a very long time. He said that they had been young academics once, fiercely ambitious, frightened of obscurity. Lane had discovered an article the tutor had taken more than inspiration from. Not outright plagiarism, he insisted on just borrowing, a borrowing that had gone too far. Lane had confronted him. They had argued. The college had been on the brink of recognizing Lane's work, and the tutor, panicked, had convinced him to stay silent. The matter had faded, buried beneath promotions and lectures and the slow sediment of time, but Lane had not forgotten. I asked whether Lane had threatened to expose him. He did not answer immediately, but when he spoke, the words were almost gentle. Lane had said he could no longer live with the secret, that the truth had become a weight he could no longer carry. The tutor had begged him to reconsider, They had met here, on the steps, at the hour Lane had considered symbolic, 7, the time he had once assigned in a lecture to a poem about inevitability. I felt a quiet ache spread through me at the thought of a man arranging his confession with the precision of a scholar citing a source. The tutor said he had not meant for Lane to die. He described a moment of sharp, desperate anger and impulsive shove, a startled stumble, a body meeting stone with alarming finality. He said it had happened too quickly for either of them to understand. And afterward, he had placed the watch beside the body, twisting the hands with trembling fingers to match the coded note in Lane's book. Not to mislead the police, he said, but to grant Lane the dignity of a narrative he might have chosen himself. The absurdity of that gesture stung more than the crime. Lewis shifted beside me, but I remained silent. There are moments when anger feels too coarse an emotion, when disappointment is a far sharper blade. I asked the tutor why he had not come forward sooner. He said he had tried to convince himself it had been an accident, that the world would be no cleaner for knowing the truth. He looked suddenly older, as though the years he had spent hiding behind his learning had finally caught up with him. The rain began to fall, then not in a downpour, but in a soft, steady patter that blurred the edges of the night. The tutor closed his eyes briefly, as if recognizing something inevitable in the sound. He said he would accompany us to the station. No theatrics, no protestations, only a quiet surrender. As we walked, I found myself glancing once more at the steps, now glistening under the rain. There was a melancholy symmetry to the past, returning to the place where it had first gone wrong, the truth stepping out of the margins at last. Oxford has always struck me as a city that prefers its tragedies understated, its confessions wrapped in scholarship. And as the tutor followed us into the waiting dark, I could not help but think that perhaps we all carry a watch within us, one that stops not at the moment of death, but at the moment we choose to face what we have avoided. Lane had stopped at 5:47. Mine, I suspected, had only just begun to move again.